You've done a lot of work with mobile development over the years. What are the 2 or 3 things that all good mobile UIs share?
So mobile UIs need to show you what they can offer you immediately. So the biggest thing a good mobile UI has is it reveals the information that you need straight away, and it doesn't cram a screen full of features like an old-fashioned computer UI would have done. It's very tempting to cram all the features in, but you really should only put 1 or 2 in each screen, and that's something that every good mobile UI shares, I think.
Is that solved primarily through some of the contextual menus, or?
Contextual menus is not always a good idea because they hide things and people don't necessarily know they're there. But if a screen shows you what it can do immediately when you look at it, that's a good mobile UI. And like sort of 1 feature per screen rather than multiple features per screen is a good place to be.
How do you feel like wearables and the IoT are going to affect the notion of cross-platform? Is it going to completely change that idea?
That's a really good question, because I think cross-platform now means web, all the native mobile platforms, and then all the native watch and eyepiece and so on platforms. And I think it will change again, but it won't change in too much of a complex way, because the way we're heading is most of the apps used on wearable devices are extensions of apps that run on the native host phone or tablet device, which means while cross-platform will still exist in the same way it always has, they'll just have another sort of screen which is displayed on the wearable. So I think it helps to think of the wearables as an additional screen to the devices we already have rather than a whole new platform.
How about on the IoT side, when we're talking about sensor-driven things, that kind of thing?
IoT is a whole other ballgame, I think. It doesn't necessarily have an interface, though, that exists beyond the phone or tablet it talks to. So I think IoT is probably nothing to worry about in terms of expanding our definition of cross-platform.
Okay. Apple's going to be open sourcing Swift. Is that a big deal or no?
It's a huge deal for us because it means Swift is a lot more interesting to people who previously wouldn't have been interested in it because it may have only worked with Apple technologies. So I think Swift on the server is something we might see a lot of, which would be really cool because it means we may, this is theoretical at the moment because nobody's done anything, we may have an easier time interoperating with server and the client when we can use the same code in 2 places at once. And this will depend on the existence of many hypothetical future Swift web frameworks, but I'm sure they'll start existing once it's open. So it's really good.
What is the single biggest coding or technical issue that you're facing right now?
So it's actually related to Swift being open source, in my opinion, and that is the biggest issue we've had right now is we run a lot of games for mobile devices, and our primary technology focus is native platforms like Objective-C, Swift, Android, and Java. So we often write our back-end technology because we don't have to serve on the web. We're like serving inside an isolated environment, like a museum, for example, where we've written a game that people play in the museum. At the museum, we write our back-ends in the same technology we're using to write the client. And Objective-C is a really terrible choice, for example, for writing a server web backend. So we're having to do all sorts of things like pretending to be an HTTP server in Objective-C and horrible hacks that we wouldn't really want to do. Something like Swift comes along, which means we can write in the same technologies we're writing on the client, but it actually makes sense to write server apps in. I think that'll be a good thing. So the biggest technical challenge right now is writing our server-side stuff in a sensible platform to be compatible with our native mobile stuff.
And Swift potentially might...
Swift potentially helps us solve that, maybe.
Okay, right.
We're really hopeful.
Fingers crossed, right. Related to that, though, what was the biggest issue that you were running into 5 years ago?
The biggest issue running into 5 years ago was probably screen sizes. Like, Android has improved in leaps and bounds over the last few years in terms of making it easier to support different size screens and different aspect ratios and devices. And iOS has gotten more complicated. But they're all arrived in the same place, which is really you should be designing an app that can scale to whatever screen size it's running on, and you shouldn't really think about a fixed screen size at all at any point. But 5 years ago, we were having to design pixel-perfect UIs for all the different size screens that we're working with, and now we just design one UI that scales beautifully. And that's a really helpful thing to have changed.
How did it evolve to that point where you're able to scale across UIs?
So originally, Apple particularly had a bunch of devices with a fixed screen size that didn't change. And when they increased the resolution, they just doubled the pixel count. So we could still use pixel-perfect UIs, and it was fine. So we could, in that area, you may remember, like UIs on iPhone used to have lots of wood paneling and textures and stuff everywhere.
Right.
It's because people got obsessed with this notion of making a pixel-perfect UI, so they went a little bit nuts and made everything align perfectly in this beautiful pre-designed UI. And now we're heading towards a bit more of where the web has gone, in that everyone's making things that can scale. So instead of making a image that is your button, and then a depressed state for that button and a touch state for that button, you make the corners of your button and then you tile it out depending on how big the button needs to be. And it's sort of becoming more modern in line with the way the web evolved. It's evolving very similar to the way the web did.
Interesting. That's interesting. Last question for you. What people or projects are you following these days?
The biggest person that I'm probably following is Chris Lattner, who is the project lead on Swift at Apple. And he's the person who's pushed for Swift to be open sourced as well, which is very exciting. He's been involved in LLVM, the compiler toolchain, and Clang, also part of the compiler process. And Apple's opened up a lot lately, which is great, and they write blog posts on Swift. They talk about what they're doing with Swift. They talk about their roadmap for Swift, and they tell us all sorts of interesting stuff on why and how they're doing certain things with Swift. And Chris Latner's a language nerd. He's got PhDs in language design and all sorts of crazy stuff. So he's really put a lot of the best modern thinking on how we might design a language into Swift. So he's really interesting to follow. It's been really enjoyable to watch a language evolve, because they've actually been quite public about it for a company like Apple, which is pretty cool.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.